Hello and welcome to another Top Grades video made easy. The focus on these 12 words is to help you write about the author's purpose. When you write about Shakespeare's purpose, you're automatically at least at grade 7. So let's see how they would work with 3 Shakespeare plays: Macbeth, Romeo and Juliet, The Tempest. Fast forward to the bits that you like. Society. Every time Shakespeare writes anything at all, he's reacting to the Jacobean or the Elizabethan society he wrote in. With Macbeth, he's criticising this martial society that values violence as proof of manhood, and he's also trying to warn the nobles not to change society by killing the king. With Romeo and Juliet, he's writing about patriarchal society and how male violence again is ruining the lives of men and women, and that's what kills the two lovers. In The Tempest, he's writing about kingship and absolute power, and happiness is only achieved once Prospero relinquishes absolute power and hands over to a younger generation. Our second word is patriarchal. A patriarchy is any society run by men in the interests of men. Well, we can clearly see that Macbeth is a patriarchal society, and the only way these ugly women, the witches, can gain any power, because they are so ugly and therefore unable to marry, and also presumably poor and therefore unable to attract a decent husband, is to turn to the supernatural. Lady Macbeth, yes, she's married to Macbeth, but she has no power on her own. That's why Macbeth calls her my dearest partner of greatness, knowing that that is what is at the root of her problems. The other issue, of course, is that the only way to achieve status in this society as a woman is to produce an heir. And Lady Macbeth is still producing milk to feed a baby that she has lost. So she needs to reclaim her status, hence the assassination of Duncan. In The Tempest, you can clearly see that Prospero exerts a patriarchal control over Miranda, and there's this whole question of how far we view him as a good father and how far we view him as an appalling father for his exploitation of his daughter. Or is he simply securing her interests, getting her a title for when she returns to Milan? Number 3, masculinity. In all 3 of these plays, he's asking whether men are in fact the best kinds of rulers. Remember, Elizabeth I has been on the throne for so long, until 1603. And we can certainly make the case that Shakespeare is interested in a more feminine kind of rule. You can, of course, flip that completely on its head and show that he creates Lady Macbeth in order to show how women are inherently even more evil than men, and she's the corrupting influence that pushes Macbeth to regicide. In Romeo and Juliet, you have to decide who is the better citizen, the better role model. Is it Juliet? Is it Romeo? It's much easier to argue for Juliet. Romeo's the one who gives in to violence, who gives in to vengeance, who causes the ultimate tragedy. Juliet tries to maintain the social order, which is why she won't have sex with Romeo before she's married to him. On the flip side of that, you can say it's patriarchal society that forces them into this marriage, and therefore it's male control, masculinity, that leads to the tragedy. In The Tempest, every single villain is male, apart from Caliban's mother, Sycorax, who doesn't actually appear, but when we look at what she's done to Ariel, we could argue that female power is presented as evil again, much like in Macbeth. Our 4th word is power. Whenever you write about power in society, linking those 2 words together, you're linking it to what Shakespeare thinks about the power of the day, King James, and how that power should be exercised. So you can quite easily read Macbeth as a lesson to King James about what sort of king he should be. Not like Macbeth, but also not like the king Malcolm pretends to be when he's testing Macduff. The problem of power in Romeo and Juliet is that the leaders of both families don't pursue peace, but pursue the feud. This, of course, is male power, male vengeance, and male pride. It's the male sense of honour that's ruling this society and therefore destroying it. In The Tempest, you can see the final message is that society is more just when a single ruler relinquishes power. And this is why Prospero breaks his magic staff and therefore allows Ferdinand and Miranda to set up a better form of rule when they return to Milan. Word number 5, Machiavellian. Machiavelli was a writer famous in Shakespeare's time, and he wrote about politics and wrote a satire about how a prince, a ruler, should behave in order to maintain power. We use it today to mean any kind of political trickery, any kind of way to manipulate events or people. And you can clearly see how the witches manipulate Macbeth, how Macbeth manipulates his wife into persuading him to kill, how he tries to manipulate others through having servants as spies. In Romeo and Juliet, we can see the Machiavellian figure is in fact the friar. He's the person who's going to try and manipulate a peace between the two families by marrying Romeo to Juliet. But presenting that as Machiavellian suggests that he's wrong, that this desire is corrupt. Easy to do in Shakespeare's time because the friar is Catholic, whereas the English are Protestant. They have rejected Catholicism, and so the friar is a symbol of something to avoid. In The Tempest, you can look at Prospero's control of Ariel in particular and his punishment of Caliban. How far is he a Machiavellian figure pursuing power for his own means versus a powerful figure who has the interests of his people at heart? Number 6, the great chain of being. The idea that everything is in its natural order, with God at the top, followed by the angels, followed by who is appointed as king or queen, followed by the nobles, followed by the merchants, followed by the normal people at the bottom, and then animals and blah blah blah. This of course is super relevant to Macbeth, who starts off as a noble but becomes more animal-like as his mind is full of scorpions because he has killed the king. This has upset the great chain of being and therefore led to divine punishment. This doesn't really fit Romeo and Juliet, but it will fit a discussion of The Tempest through the role of Caliban. Where does he belong in that chain? Should he be the natural king of the island, or should he be treated as an animal? Number 7, original sin. This is the Catholic idea that we are all born with the sin of Adam and Eve when they defied God and started eating of the tree, the forbidden fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. They were expelled from Eden as a punishment. Various other punishments followed, and the idea is that ever since then we are all carrying that punishment with us because we all carry that original sin with us. In other words, we are born with a greater capacity for evil than for good, which is why Christianity has to teach us to be good. Left to our own nature, we're not. You can easily see how Macbeth and Lady Macbeth enact their actual sin. They tear away the Christian rules of civilization and give vent to all their sins, which almost destroys Scotland in a civil war. In Romeo and Juliet, you can see the same. Despite the fact that the lovers want peace, want to be united, their sinful nature, and in particular Romeo's, means that he turns to vengeance and violence as soon as things start going wrong. We can argue the same about Juliet. She goes to the friar and blackmails him with the threat of killing herself. This again, original sin. Committing suicide, a huge sin against God. Only God can take a life. In The Tempest, it's really interesting to look at Caliban and his feelings for Miranda. Does this show that he is absolutely sinful? He hasn't had a Christian education and therefore will exercise his lust in an uncontrolled way? Or is Shakespeare arguing that the punishment he receives does not fit the crime? Education would have worked instead. Number 8 is fate. In Shakespeare's plays, characters are constantly wrestling with how far they can act on their own choices versus how far their fate is controlled either by God or by society. In Macbeth, Shakespeare points out that Macbeth could simply have waited. He would have become king anyway. But instead, he chooses to accelerate that fate by assassinating the king, which leads to all the tragedies that follow. In Romeo and Juliet, the lovers try to escape their fate by marrying, but that very thing, the marriage, leads to the destruction. The prologue tells us that this is from the fatal loins of their parents. They have caused this fate. But if we go back to the ball scene, Romeo has a vision that something terrible will happen if he goes to the ball. Does he listen to it? No. He says, "Let he who directs my sail direct my course." In other words, he just allows fate to carry on, even though he knows that fate is going to be awful. So in Macbeth, Shakespeare implies that characters should follow their fate, but in Romeo and Juliet, he indicates that they shouldn't. Unless you read Romeo and Juliet as a way of fate stepping in to get rid of the feud. Yet it's unfortunate that the only way to do it is to kill the lovers, but actually that saves society from an eternal circle of violence. This idea of God sacrificing for humanity is what the resurrection story is all about. God sends his son down to earth so that he will be killed by man, and obviously Jesus embodies God, so God himself is partly killed by man in order to save society. A radical idea for us now, but it's an idea that Shakespeare's audience would be familiar with. Prospero completely ignores fate. He takes on the godly powers of trying to control everyone else's fate, but through Ariel's intervention, Prospero is able to step back and say, I don't want this godlike power. There must be a fairer way to deal with people, and that fairer way is Christian forgiveness. A Christian message. At number 9, we have two opposing words, utopian and dystopian. With a utopia, you try and create a perfect world. A dystopia is a world that has fallen away from perfection and become damaged and damaging. You can easily write about the societies in all of those plays as either dystopian or utopian. The Tempest is the one that most closely deals with what a utopia is like, and Romeo and Juliet deals with English society and says, look, are we becoming dystopian because we've given too much power to men? After all, young men in England were allowed to walk around with daggers and swords. The act of killing in revenge, or even as happens with Mercutio and Tybalt, almost by accident, was common. Shakespeare was actually commenting on a famous duel and feud between two families of his day. And so the play appears to be a rejection of that culture. Number 10, justice. When you look at the end of each of the plays, it's really easy for you to say, what is Shakespeare saying about a just society? He always tries to restore the natural order, and when you examine the ending, you can see whether he wants a Christian society, what kind of ruler he wants to rule it. Does he want the status quo, as he does in Macbeth, or a completely different society that is much more sensitive, as in Romeo and Juliet, or one that rejects absolute power, as in The Tempest? At number 11, we have the word redemption. This is a Christian idea. We commit sins, but we can redeem ourselves through goodness. That's how we all get over original sin and get into heaven. Well, he doesn't have that moral journey precisely in his plays. Instead, he has the idea of how we can overcome the bad acts of our past. In Macbeth, Macbeth and Lady Macbeth refuse to be redeemed, and so they go to hell. Macduff, on the other hand, tries to redeem himself as a husband. He has abandoned his family who've been killed by Macbeth, and therefore he won't fight anybody else until he has found Macbeth, and only then will he unsheath his sword, a way to redeem himself as a failed husband and father. At the same time, this redeems the country of Scotland from the tyranny of Macbeth's rule. In Romeo and Juliet, Montague and Capulet try to redeem their sin of the feud by constructing these golden statues of Romeo and Juliet, not just to symbolise peace, but to bring about peace between the two families. Prospero tries to redeem himself by giving up power and leaving the island to Caliban and the rule of Milan to Ferdinand and Miranda. And number 12, conscience. So Shakespeare's writing at a really interesting time. Up until about 30 years before Shakespeare's writing plays, all plays are morality tales. They're morality plays written to exhibit good and evil, to deliver the messages of Christianity and even retell biblical stories. It's only when Shakespeare and his contemporaries start writing that they start inventing characters who think for themselves. Shakespeare dives into this idea of the soliloquy, characters speaking directly to the audience, not manipulating the audience but delivering their innermost true thoughts. All these plays are full of these soliloquies, and this is where we get the drama of characters trying to work out what decision they should make, what choice would be good, what choice would be evil. Obviously we see that with Macbeth all the way through the play. With Romeo and Juliet we see it with the friar, where he makes the fateful choice to help the lovers marry in secret without their parents' knowledge. This is Shakespeare's way of saying the friar was wrong. So you can access the word conscience when you're trying to talk about the characters as individuals. Remember, the characters are always constructs in order to represent Shakespeare's ideas, but by portraying them as individuals with psychological reasons for doing what they're doing, you're jumping to the top of the mark scheme. By referring to the word conscience, you're going to bring it back to the ideas of good and evil, the Christian values of the society that Shakespeare's writing about and for. Now, if you've listened to all of that, it will be quite easy for you to write down those 12 words, put them on a piece of paper, and just practice using them to write about quotes or events in the plays that you are studying. By the way, these don't just work with Shakespeare. You can apply all but number 6 and number 7 to every single text that you study. When you do that, you're not just going to get marks for using advanced vocabulary. That's not where the marks are. You're going to get the marks because you link it to the author's ideas, and that is a minimum of grade 7. Top tip, grade 9 essays always use these 2 words repeatedly to explain the author's ideas. In the video coming up now, I will show you how to use the top vocabulary for other texts.